Carolyn Dube here, and today I'm answering that age-old question, what's the best paint to use on a jelly plate? Well, and if you want to know the very best, the only paint that works every single time in every single way with the jelly plate, I'm sorry, you're going to be disappointed because I don't have that for you. What I do have for you here is I'm going to be using 5 different kinds of paint so you can see how they behave on the jelly plate. Along the way, I'm going to be answering some of those questions that I've been asked or I've seen pop up about jelly printing that people kind of wonder, how do I deal with this? What do I do about this? So that when you're finished watching this video, you have a better understanding of the different kinds of paints so that when you're jelly printing with the paints that you have a little more knowledge to help you kind of adjust to get the prints that you want. So enough of my talking, let's get into the play. Here are the 5 paints that I'm going to experiment with. Each one of them is different and they each behave a little differently. Notice that I'm saying they behave differently. Not good or bad, it's just different. I'm working on the big 12 by 14 jelly plate just so I have some space to work on. And that brayer, yeah, I'm going to have to go to the smaller one to get this all to fit on here. For the scientific validity of this test, okay, it's not going to be that valid, it's not that scientific, but in order for the results to be as uniform as possible, I am going to do something I rarely do, so this is a big deal for me to actually do this. I am going to clean off the big chunks of paint from the jelly plate. Now, I'm not going to clean every little speck of paint off of this, but I'm going to clean the big stuff off. I'm taking some packing tape and I'm just putting it around the edges because that's where I tend to get the biggest buildup. I will tell you some of that paint is actually pretty crusty. It's very thick over there. And no matter how thick I let it get or how old, it will still come up. Now you can see I'm kind of bending the jelly plate, and what I'm doing there is just really loosening up the dried paint. That way it will come right up with the tape. So I've got it loosened up a little bit there, and now I'm just going to peel up my pieces of packing tape, and these become little pieces of art right by themselves, and they're fun to use in things. Well, now that it's all clean, let's take a look at the paints. So the first paint I'm going to use is Golden's Open Acrylics. And I tried to keep a similar color here with all of these, but it's, as close as I can get with my stash. Next one is Heavy Bodied Paint from Liquitex. Then I've got some Amsterdam. This is their student grade acrylic. Heading into, and you can tell that those are thicker ones. Now I'm going to head into ones that are a little more fluid. This is the Deco Arts mixed media paints, they're fluid acrylics. And I'm going to put a little bit more on there because it's spreading out. And then I've got some craft paint. Now this stuff is actually fairly old and fairly thick and gloppy there, so I guess I've had it for a while. Each one of these paints behaves a little bit differently. Now as I'm brayering on the open acrylics have something added to them so that they stay workable or wet a whole lot longer than average acrylics. So that makes them behave very well with the jelly plate. Then in the heavy-bodied paints, it's a thicker paint, and you can see the coverage that I'm getting there. You can't see anything underneath the jelly plate. I'm going to clean off that brayer right over there on a piece of actually my kids' old homework papers. Those are fun to use to clean up on. Now I've got the Amsterdam paint here, and this is where there's proof that I kind of have a tendency to squirt out too much paint. So I err on the side generally of more paint than what I need. So what I'm trying to do is kind of brayer off some of it. By just wiping off that brayer over there, pick up some paint, and then clean off the brayer. Gonna head into the fluids now, and this one feels very different when I'm brayering on it because it's almost like I'm pushing a liquid around. It's not so thick, and it's a fluid acrylic. That's what it's designed to be, is more fluid or more water-like, but it's not really watery, but you know what I mean. And then there is the craft paint. So this gives you an idea of how they spread on the jelly plate. Now let's see how they print. And I've got a piece of old scrapbook paper here, so it's a fairly lightweight piece of paper. It was cheap scrapbook paper. And I'm going to push this down, and when I lift it up, you're going to be able to see how each of the 5 paints behaved. And I'm going to flip it up. As I turn it over, of course, let me flip it around one more time. That way, I've got the open acrylic on one side all the way over to the folk art on the other side. For me, the first print, I can usually get those no problem. It's the ghost print, the ones that come after it that make the magic for me. So let's see what we get out of print number 2. And just so you know, I'm also working very quickly here because paint will dry. So as I flip this over, you can see how much of the paint came up with the second pull. And there's more white space on that paper. Well, now it's time for print number 3. And by the time I get to the third print, those get very, very ghosty. On this one, I'm willing to bet there's going to be a whole lot of white space. As I lift this up, I'm going to take a peek and see if we got any color at all on it, and we got some. So wherever the paint was really thick, that's where you still see the lines from, or here where the open acrylic is, that's where I've actually got the most coverage of pigment still remaining after the third pull, or on the third pull. Now with each of these paints, they all worked well on the Gelli plate. The question is, what look are you trying to go for, or what feels most comfortable? And if you're finding that you're not getting much of a print for the second print, it may be that you need to use a little more paint with it. Well, let's see how this kind of thing works with a stencil. I'm going to take some of the heavy body Liquitex paint, and I'm going to take another craft paint that I have. This one's from Americana, and it's a much more fluid, runnier paint. So I've got something that's a thicker paint, and I've got a runnier, more fluid paint. That way you can see the difference between them. So I'm going to brayer them on just like what I did in the other one, and you can see how much coverage I'm getting with this because what's underneath my Gelli plate, what's really on my countertop, is disappearing. Well, paper really bunched up there. And when I come over this and do the craft paint, it's very fluid, so it's almost like squeegeeing a liquid across there just because it's so much more fluid. Now, I've heard people talk about how they've got brayer lines and things. If you want to get rid of some of those brayer lines, what that means is you need to brayer with a very gentle touch. If I'm working in more of a heavy-bodied paint or a thicker paint, it's easier for me to sort of wipe out or roll out those lines. When I'm working in a fluid, I have got to use just absolutely feathered touch to smooth out those lines. For that reason, I tend to just say those lines add a little texture and interest to it, and I rarely actually take the time to work out the lines. So let's talk about stencils with the Gelli plate. When you put the stencil down, you've got to get the paper to touch the paint. That makes sense, right? If you've got a thick stencil, you have to work hard to get that paper in there. If you're working with a thinner stencil, you don't have to work as hard. I'm using a lightweight paper, so just by rubbing my fingers up there on the top on those smaller openings to make sure I've got contact there, that's probably all I need. If you're using heavier papers, you have to work a little bit harder at it. So here's what the first pull looks like. This is when I have the wettest paint, the maximum amount of paint. So there's my heavy body on that side, and there is my craft paint on the other side. So it gives you an idea, nice coverage, looking good. So that's first print. Now let's see what we get off of print number 2. So I'm going to pull the stencil away. This is actually the print that I like the most when I use a stencil with the Gelli plate, because it gives me a look that I could not get by just putting paint straight through the stencil. You're also going to see a difference between the two types of paint. So as I lift this up, I would expect there to be more heavy-bodied paint color than there to be from the more fluid color. And sure enough, that's what happened. I have to flip this around again to match up heavy body side to craft paint side. There's less paint on the second pull from the craft paint, and that might be the look that you're after. Not that either one of those looks is good or bad. It's a matter of what look did you want to create. Going to try for pull number 3. I don't think there's a whole lot on here, but you know, you never know what's going to show up. So as I flip this over, not a lot, but my best ghost print came from the side with the heavy body. There was really nothing happening over on the craft paint side for pull number 3. And again, I'd like to stress, one paint is not better than the other. They just give you different results. So it's a matter of getting comfortable with how the paints behave on your Gelli plate. Now when I put paint down, I usually err on the side of putting way too much paint down. To try and duplicate some of the results that people say they've been getting, I'm going to put a very, very small amount of paint onto that Gelli plate. It's so small, it almost looks like there isn't paint there. Now the less paint that I have on there, the faster it's going to dry, so I have to move quickly. I'm going to put the stencil back down and I'm going to put a piece of paper on top of it, and you're going to see a difference between the kind of prints that you get when you use a very small amount of paint as opposed to a larger amount of paint. Again, no way is right or wrong here. It's just a matter of what result that you want. So as I really pushing this down to make sure I've got contact between the paper and the plate around that stencil, I'm going to lift it up if I can grab it with my hand. And here's what the very first pull looks like. It almost looks more like a ghost print than a first pull kind of print. So here was the first print using lots of paint, and here was the first print using very little paint. Oh, yep, and I got to turn them around so we have the heavy body on the same side. Gives you an idea there. By the way, the stencil that I've been using is my Arched Aqueduct stencil from over at Stencil Girl Products. So now you know how you can get different looks off of that stencil based on how much paint you use. I spent way too much time talking, so I know there isn't any kind of ghost print there, so I'm not even going to bother and try and pull that up. One of the things I've heard from several people is that they have trouble avoiding mud when mixing colors on the Gelli plate. What I'm going to show you here is how to mix not only colors but types of paint. I have got some heavy bodied acrylic there, I have got some golden open, and I'm going to bring in some Amsterdam. If it's an acrylic paint, I call it fair game to use on the Gelli plate, and I can mix brands and types of paint as much as I want. If you'd like to know more about how to mix colors on the Gelli plate, including the entire rainbow, how to do it without creating mud, I've got all sorts of information about that in my online workshop called One Pull Wonders, how to get very complex looking Gelli prints with just one pull. Now this time I'm using 3 colors that can absolutely blend together, and I'm just going to kind of mix them around a little bit. And as I'm doing this, you can probably see all those lines from my brayer. I love those lines, and I leave them in there. As a matter of fact, sometimes I even try and make them happen. And then just keep spreading the paint around until you've got it about how you want it to look. I'm going to bring in another piece of that old scrapbook paper, and I'm going to pull my print. Now you know from earlier the first print is going to have lots of paint on it because that's when there's the most amount of paint on the Gelli plate. So as I lift this up, it's going to be a lot more vibrant just because it has the maximum amount of paint. So you can see all my brayer lines in there, adding some interest to it. Now let's put on another piece of paper and see what we get. And this is where you're going to see the differences in the paints. As we were talking earlier in the video, there is some difference on how they behave on the Gelli plate. And when you mix them together side by side like this, it's a little bit easier to see how they're different. Because wherever the paint has started to dry or there's less paint, I'm going to start to see more white paper. And I've got more white paper in the green and yellow than I do in the teal area. Well, here are the 2 prints side by side. Now, which one of these is the right way to do it? You know what? They're both fantastic. It's a matter of what you want to get from it. Just know that the less paint that's on the Gelli plate, the more white space you're going to get. Or if the paint dries very quickly, you're going to get more of that white space. So depending on the look you want, if you want more white space, then go for smaller amounts of paint or more fluid paints. If you want a thicker solid coverage, you either want to use more paint or a thicker, heavier body type paint. Well, thanks for joining me for today's Play with the Gelli plate. If you've enjoyed this video and would like more inspiration, head on over and check out my YouTube channel. I've got lots and lots of videos over there with the Gelli plate. And if you'd like to know more about the whys and the hows and have a deeper understanding of using the Gelli plate to create the prints that you want, I've got my latest workshop called One Pull Wonders. And I cover everything in there from stencils, color theory, layering colors, all sorts of things, and it's all done in one pull. And that workshop is for both people brand new to the Gelli plate as well as veterans, because everything is broken down step by step. Thanks for being a part of this colorful journey.